Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Deuteronomy.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Today, we're on the fifth book of the Bible. This is the last book of the opening chunk of the Bible that Christians call the Pentateuch, Jews call the Torah. And all of this is written by Moses, but we get a very different version of Moses in all of them. And now that we're into the book of Deuteronomy, we are getting old man reflective Moses, who is no longer throwing his energy at the other old people. He is throwing his energy at the next generation. And his motivation for this is more than just a reflection on his life and thinking, I want to have a legacy here, and so I need to invest in these young people. There's something going on here in terms of God's relationship with the people that is prompting this. And that is, as you'll recall from the previous book, Numbers, that it was only supposed to take 2 weeks to go from Mount Sinai, where God gave the law at the end of Exodus. Then at the beginning of Numbers, it's supposed to take just 2 weeks to walk up to Canaan and be like, well, the God who did all that other miraculous stuff, he's going to deliver these little kingdoms and tribes and stuff into our hands, and then we're going to have the land that was promised to Abraham. This is so exciting. But the people, despite all they've seen, despite the fact that they're literally being led by the visible presence of God with a cloud in the book of Numbers, they're just not up for it. They don't have the heart for it, and they're really complaining. And in Numbers 14, the people decide, we got to depose Moses. This is the wrong leadership. We're not going in and taking the land. We don't have any plan B. I don't know what we're going to do instead. But we can't go there. Maybe back to Egypt. I don't know, but we're out. And then in one of the most horrifying passages in the whole Bible, God responds to the people of Israel and is like, okay, I'm going to give you what you want. For each of the 40 days that the spies were in there checking out the land, you all are going to spend 1 year out here in the desert wandering around aimlessly until all of this generation who rejected my leadership as God are dead. And then the next generation will go in and take the land, and we'll move forward with them. You're going to find out what it's like to have me against you. Dang. Well, between what we hear about in Numbers and what we get in Deuteronomy, something like 40 years pass, and a bunch of the old generation who complained and were stubborn and rejected God's leadership, they have died off. In fact, they're almost all dead. And now Israel is right at the doorstep of the promised land with a whole new generation that's been raised up, and we come into the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy, on its surface, it just looks incredibly boring and maybe redundant. I'm not trying to be mean to the Bible. I really, really like it. That's why I do this podcast. That's why we're having these conversations. I think it's great. But come on, let's be honest. On the surface, it looks like we've already covered the material that's in Deuteronomy. Heck, even the name means second law, like we're taking another run at this thing. But a closer look at this book demonstrates that there's something really interesting happening here narratively, and that we're learning more stuff about God and his character and the redemptive plan and how it's all going to play out. So the book is structured around a series of speeches from Moses. The first speech is basically just a rehash of what we got in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, with a lot of emphasis on numbers. So it's the story I was just recapping about everything that God has done and how the people behaved the way they did and why God has allowed them to wander in the desert for all this time. But who's Moses talking to in this speech, and why does he have to review all of this? Well, again, he's talking to the kids. They don't get everything right in the book of Deuteronomy. They're a little bit complainy, but not as much as their parents, because they never knew Egypt and the relative stability, though it was slave stability, that was enjoyed there in the desert. There's no sense of how the provision is going to happen. It's dry and hot and miserable and boring. And you might think of Egypt that way, but Egypt at this point in history was like the most fertile, lush, temperate place you could possibly imagine living, except other than maybe Canaan, this land flowing of milk and honey that is promised to them. The point is, this next generation, they ain't perfect, but they don't know all of these details, and they might be assigning their own narrative to everything that's happened here. And Moses is like, no, I'm going to give you a recap so that you are crystal clear on what the actual narrative is, and so that you understand it's not flattering. And he's like, I just got to boil it down to the point for these guys of all the law and the commands and everything else. And so he says this in Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them upon your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Now, this is obviously a very famous passage. This gets referenced in the Gospels a whole bunch. Jesus affirms that this is the chief commandment, and he says, and also love your neighbor as yourself. There's a term for this beautiful part of Scripture. It's called the Shema, and it's this heartfelt call, not just to do what God says and go conquer some land or whatever. I mean, that's in there, but it's to love God. A theme that is paid off in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus shows up in his first big speech as a public figure is to call people back to the impulse that's right here, to love God with your heart, not to do these religious activities and so forth just for external approval or because these are the social dance steps we've all agreed upon, but to reflect on the character of God and the heart of God's commands and to operate in keeping with those, what we call in the New Testament, values of the kingdom. The emphasis here is that Israel has one God, and they're only going to worship this one God. It's a preparatory statement before they go into this land that has a whole lot of different gods. We're not going to worship those gods. To do so would be calamitous, and not just because it would pollute the purity of the Hebrew people, but because the Hebrew people are unique. They're carrying the redemptive plan in their lineage. They are a nation of priests who are to bless the nations. Like, you just can't go mingle your religion with a bunch of fake religions. It waters the whole thing down. You can't risk it. You're playing with fire there. So the second speech that Moses gives is, again, this theme of a second law. It's an expansion on, a reiteration of a whole bunch of the stuff that we saw back in Leviticus. And there's a bunch of stuff in this law that has a lot to do with relationships between people and how to do society. That sounds very familiar and just makes sense. It's intuitive. There's a few things in here, though, that you're going to look at and go, it seems oddly specific. I don't totally get why that is a rule. But if you look closely enough at all of it, you will see two things that are at the heart of all of these laws that God is laying down and that Moses is reciting to this next generation that's about to take the land. One, these laws are somehow instructive regarding the character of God. And two, at the heart of all of these things is right relationship with others and some notion of justice. Now, that notion of justice isn't going to make a ton of sense unless you contrast it with the global understanding of law and justice and people and societal roles and all of that existed. If you imagine that whatever laws and social preferences we have now is the most enlightened humanity has ever been, and there's a lot of hubris in that assumption, but if you assume that, then these laws are going to look a little bit backwards at times. But if you look at them in the historical context, they're going to look wildly progressive, inclusive, conscious of the people in society who would have no power or recourse to get justice for the things that other people might inflict on them. The original audience, this new generation that is receiving this second uttering of the law, they're going to get that. They're going to have their minds blown when they understand what everybody else is doing with the law compared to what they're going to do with the law. For you and me, it takes a little bit of thinking outside of ourselves to fully appreciate everything that's going on there. The final speech from Moses has a really different feel. It's like the last hurrah of an old dude being informed directly by God, I should say, urging this next generation to care about the right stuff. And he's realistic in these closing words of his life and his ministry. He's like, look, you're going to screw things up. It's going to get bad. You're going to sin. You're going to rebel. You're going to get corrected by God when you go into the land. But you're also going to obey, and you're also going to get things right. So he reiterates the basic terms of the covenant that we get all the way back from the book of Exodus. God is going to be your God. You are going to be his people. But we're still a nation of priests. All of this is happening in the view of the world and with the long-term redemption of the larger world in mind. So everybody's going to know that yours is the one true God. If you obey him, he's going to bless you. If you disobey him, he's going to punish you. And he even very humbly and honestly points to himself, both in the first speech and in this speech, as an example of both of those realities in his own life. So at the very end of the last book of the 5 books of Moses, in his final blessing to this new generation, Moses reiterates themes that are woven into the 4 books that came before, including this one about the brokenness of humanity, an evil, a stain, a darkness that is on the heart, an inability to help ourselves, even if we change our conditions or our government, or even if there's a big purge, it doesn't matter. Something is broken. There's a curse of sin and death and separation from God that traces all the way back to the stunt that serpent pulled in the garden. But right after the serpent pulled that stunt, God, in his curse of that serpent, also offers this promise of blessing. There's this one who is to come, this one who's going to get struck by the serpent, but who's ultimately going to crush the head of the serpent. We now know that one is going to come out of the line of Abraham. We now know that it's going to come out of this nation that is in covenant with God through the covenant that God made with Moses. We know that this one who is to come, who's going to straighten things out that no human has been able to find a way to straighten out, that even strict obedience to the law, we can now tell, even that won't work to straighten this out. That one is coming. And there's going to be some mechanism in there by which the heart of humanity can be made whole, can be made right, and a return to the paradigm of Eden, or maybe even something better, can be in view. Then, like Aaron before him, Moses hands off authority to the next guy. It's Joshua, and he goes up on the mountain and he dies, and he never makes it into the promised land at all. But wow, does he play his role in moving this story forward. So I think what we just saw is a great prologue that sets up all the questions that are going to be answered throughout the rest of the Bible. How's this relationship going to play out between God and this nation of priests, Israel? How's the conquest going to go? How's this generation going to do? What are they going to screw up? What are they going to get right? How's the next generation going to do? When you visualize the book of Deuteronomy, picture old man Moses explaining the law to the kids, or maybe more simply, just visualize a contract, a covenant. When you think about the theme, think about that lasting covenant and how it's going to transcend generations. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, check out Deuteronomy 6 and then the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. And on that note, I'm proud to announce that we have leveled up on Deuteronomy. Nice job, everybody. Next time around, we are past the writings of Moses and into a new regime, new leadership. We're into the book of Joshua, and it looks like the plot is about to move forward very dramatically. I'm excited for it. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.